first of all, am personally curious. Like, for example, as a Jew, what necessarily makes me unsaved versus saved? But then expanding off of that, I do, like, you raise an interesting point about how in Scripture there is not a good justification for a lot of these malicious acts.
Correct.
But also at the same time, a lot of institutions that are Christian institutions act in the name of Christ, take a lot of acts that go directly in the face of that. So one thing for me is, I think with the idea of saved versus unsaved, there's been a lot, that's been a major reasoning for why there's been a lot of like cultural erasure in history, which I think is not a great thing. And I'm just curious about kind of that dissonance between religion suggesting that individuals act out this one way and then the institutions that teach that religion acting in a different.
The overwhelming evidence is just exactly what you said, that many Christian institutions have perverted Christ, they've abused people, they've been racist, they've been greedy as all get out. I think you'd be an idiot to put your faith ultimately in a Christian institution. I don't care what that institution is.
This is maybe viewing Christians as a, I guess, political force rather than individuals, but it is, it is maybe harder to accept that as like, and like I personally don't necessarily have any ill will, but it is difficult to say, okay, well, all of the people who believe this thing disagree with this action, but then everyone as an actor in the world is doing these things.
Has America always followed the teachings of Jesus?
No.
Correct. Therefore, if anybody tells you that America is a Christian country, I would encourage you to ask them, please tell me what you mean when you say that. When America follows Jesus Christ, America is great. When America turns its back on Christ, America turns ugly real fast.
In the dialogue above, the two speakers present the argument that the credibility of Christianity must be separated from the failures of Christian institutions, and I observe that this is a necessary distinction, but it is not sufficient by itself to resolve the moral tension being raised. On one side, the questioner is not merely attacking Christians as a political bloc. He is pointing to a lived contradiction. Scripture is said to form moral people, yet institutions that publicly carry Christ's name have historically produced coercion, racism, greed, and cultural erasure. This is not a cheap gotcha. It is the exact kind of empirical objection that forces any religion to explain why its public fruits often look unlike its stated ideals. On the other side, the respondent answers by drawing a boundary. Do not put ultimate faith in institutions. Put it in Christ. That boundary is logically clean, and it prevents a fallacy, judging a belief system solely by its worst representatives. However, the respondent's rhetorical intensity, "you'd be an idiot," risks undermining his own point. If the goal is to help a skeptic disentangle Christ from corrupt institutions, contemptuous phrasing can sound like evasion rather than clarity, and it can push the listener further into distrust. The strongest move here is actually implicit. If Christianity claims to be true, then it must be able to condemn Christian hypocrisy without collapsing into self-defense. The questioner's dissonance is a real problem, and the respondent's distinction is a good first step. But the next step must be sharper. What objective method distinguishes true Christ from institutional Christ, when institutions are often the ones defining doctrine, shaping culture, and representing Christianity to the world? Without that bridge, Christ is pure, the church is corrupt, can become a convenient shield rather than an explanation. We now continue with the debate, 𝗖𝗿𝗶𝘁 discussion.
I don't care if it's slavery, child sex traffic trade, the exportation of pornography, greed, the abuse of power. America turns ugly because it turns its back on Christ. But when America follows Christ, it is an incredibly great country. And you just go right down through American history and you know. Great things, obeying Christ, horrible things, disobeying Christ, being grotesquely narcissistic, self-obsessed, elitist. I mean, just the list goes on and on.
I guess in any case, whether, regardless of the religion, but with Christian actors who act against Christ, especially when it seems that let's say the far majority of Christians probably belong to one of these organizations that has advocated for something that it seems to be would be against these teachings.
I think that is a inaccurate view of history. When you look at the United States, there are a boatload of Americans who have given money, who have fought to end slavery in the Civil War. I mean, let's remember, guys, it was Northern Christians who led the charge for the abolitionist movement. It was a guy named Frederick Douglass, who had been a slave, who got his freedom, converted to Christ, and became a leader in the abolitionist movement. Harriet Tubman, follower of Christ. Dr. Martin Luther King, follower of Christ. Did these people live perfect lives? No, none of them are perfect. Because in order to be a Christian, you have to acknowledge, I am not perfect. I need the grace of God. I need the forgiveness of Christ. But then due to their faith, they lived lives of generosity, lives committed to justice. But are there a tremendous number of hypocrites? Yes, sir, there are. And one of the saddest examples of that would be all the anti-Semitism that is promoted in the name of Christianity. I hate that. I'm embarrassed by that. That is wrong. I mean, just think how wrong it is. I believe in Jesus, and I'm anti-Semitic. Jesus was a Jew. I believe in him, but I'm anti-Semitic. I think it would be far more accurate to say, your brain's not working very well. How on earth can you say, I believe in a first century Jew, that he's God in human form, and then go out and be anti-Semitic?
Because I appreciate your point that there have been great moral acts taken in the name of Christianity. But I think there are also many, arguably more examples of the opposite. So is it then just that, if not a majority, a substantial amount of Christians you just write off as hypocritical and then?
The sin that Christ attacked most harshly was the sin of hypocrisy. So it was a problem at Christ's time. It's a problem today. So please don't give a Christian hypocrite the power to turn you off to the true Christ, who didn't have a hypocritical bone in his body. Now, the classic example of that is the African American church. Their forefathers and foremothers were enslaved here in this country by, quote, Christians, unquote. What rank hypocrisy. And yet my African American brothers and sisters have had the open-mindedness and the intellectual objectivity to not give a white Christian racist the power to turn them off to the true Christ, who did not have a racist bone in his body. Just to drive this point home, my wife and I were walking on the Appalachian Trail. A good gentleman was walking behind us, and all of a sudden he was beside me. And so I began a conversation with him, and yes, I like to talk about God and faith, as you can imagine. So I'm talking about just religion with him. And I asked him what he thought about Islam. And he said, 9/11. I don't have to study any more about Islam. Do you know how bigoted that is?
Yeah.
That's incredible. It's intellectually lazy. It's saying, oh, the terrorists who blew the World Trade Center apart in New York City on 9/11, that's an accurate representation of Muhammad and Islam. That's baloney. The far majority of my Muslim friends are wonderfully kind, nice people. They're not terrorists who go around blowing buildings apart. So the challenge when it comes to who is Muhammad is read the Quran, do your homework, and ask yourself, is the evidence of the way Muhammad taught, lived, died, and whatever happened after his death point to his reliability, or does it not? The same thing you got to do with Jesus. Does the evidence of...
In the dialogue above, the two speakers present the argument that Christianity should be evaluated through its best moral contributions rather than its hypocritical abuses. And I observe that both sides are partly right, but each risks a selective reading that can distort the full picture. The questioner's pressure point is important. If most Christians belong to organizations that advocate actions contrary to Jesus' teachings, then hypocrisy is not an exception. It becomes a structural issue. Even if that far majority claim is overstated, the underlying concern remains. Institutions are not marginal. They shape what Christianity looks like in history. So the question is not merely, are there hypocrites, but why does hypocrisy repeatedly scale, reproduce, and persist under Christian banners. The respondent answers by invoking counter-history, abolitionists, civil rights leaders, and famous Christian reformers. This is a legitimate corrective. It demonstrates that Christianity has produced moral courage and sacrificial justice, and it blocks the simplistic narrative that Christianity only harms. Yet the rhetorical move can become a mirror image fallacy, cherry-picking saints to erase scandals, just as critics cherry-pick scandals to erase saints. The sharper issue is causality. If Christians fought both for slavery and against slavery, both for oppression and for liberation, then Christian identity alone cannot explain outcomes. Something else is operating. Competing interpretations of Scripture, economic incentives, cultural power, and institutional self-preservation. The respondent comes closest to a serious diagnosis when he condemns anti-Semitism as hypocrisy and incoherence. Jesus was a Jew. That line is logically strong. A belief system that produces hatred toward the ethnicity of its own founder has a deep internal contradiction. However, the insult, "your brain's not working very well," again weakens the moral force of the critique. A more rigorous approach would be, anti-Semitism in the name of Christ is not merely inconsistent. It is evidence of doctrinal corruption, catechetical failure, and institutional sin that must be named and corrected. If Christianity is true, its internal resources should allow it to judge itself, reform itself, and protect the vulnerable without relying on defensive rhetoric or selective history. We now continue with the debate discussion.
The way Jesus lived, taught, died, and rose from the dead point to his credibility, or does it not?
So I'm kind of like 50-50, like atheist, agnostic. My friend Zion's brought me out here today. He's over there in the crowd. He's Christian.
Yeah.
So my question is, I was gonna ask about like the validity of like Christianity, but you guys talked about that a lot, so I'll kind of just skip that. What makes you believe in Christianity over like other religions? And then when did you start becoming a believer?
Because of who Jesus Christ is. Okay, if you're an honest truth seeker, then you better start cracking some books. I almost ditched my faith my sophomore year of college because I started wondering, is there more evidence for Christianity or hedonism? Because I like to have a lot of fun in life and experience a lot of pleasure. And that fits my experience. So maybe the earth just ends, we fall through a trap door into nothingness. So why not just live for narcissistic hedonism? It's all about me. It doesn't make sense to serve other people unless I feel better about myself in going to the soup kitchen. But it's all about me ultimately because I want my own meaning and purpose and happiness here on this planet because I know there's nothing else. There's no God asking me to serve. So why would I serve? Or for example, if I could get away as a free rider on cheating on a lot of my tests here at this school, and it's not going to really hurt anybody, why not do so? I think it makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. So it's all a form of narcissism that if I was an atheist and a hedonist specifically, I think that's consistent with that worldview. Or it's consistent just with raised red in tooth and claw, the evolutionary theory. The powerful dominate the weak. And so why not just have buddies who are powerful? Why not look at the handicapped and say, here's just a tax on society. Come on, this world is all there is. Let's purify things, eugenics, to make things a lot better for the powerful that eat the weak. That's consistent with an atheistic worldview. But I think so many atheists are inconsistent, and all of a sudden they smuggle in these Christian, Judeo-Christian values that this nation was built upon, and they say, no, let's have human rights. Let's say all people are valuable. Hey, let's go about being compassionate, kind, and having pity for others. Hey, let's go about even trying to forgive an enemy. Well, you're just stealing from the Christian faith and calling yourself an atheist, but you're really just a Christian.
So yeah, wait, when did you guys become Christian?
I became a Christian, well, I got baptized when I was 10. But like I said, my sophomore year of college, a lot of my friends were saying, all of our Mormon friends are brainwashed. And I looked at them right in the face and I said, well, how do you know we're not brainwashed? Mm-hmm. We got taken to church, so we better start doing our homework to figure out if our worldview is correct. Mm-hmm. And so I believe, based off of the historical evidence of the resurrection, there's a ton of it. And scholars just came out with a new 700-page volume 1 of all evidence of just the resurrection. Volume 1 of, I think there's going to be like 4 or 5. And so there's only more and more evidence coming about this resurrection. How did the resurrection, I mean, it was a total hoax that just turned the world Christian? That takes more faith for me to believe then actually, if there truly is a God, if I believe in God, that this could actually happen.
So you kind of became Christian when you said you were like 10, sort of?
Yeah.
Okay. And do you think that your like upbringing, like your family had a big influence in that?
Partial influence.
Because I was talking to my friend about this too. Like, I feel like within like religion, it seems like most people that I know that are Christian is like the majority of the people I would say who I know that are religious, what they follow. They're Christian because they were raised Christian. And I feel like maybe if they weren't, they wouldn't be, I guess. So
Yeah.
I was going to ask you guys about that too.
Well, I'm a PK, pastor's kid, so I have a 75% chance of not being a Christian.
Oh, really? Okay.
75%.
Okay.
And so you even asking the question actually shows that you have a form of atheistic upbringing.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a very atheist question you just asked. So it's called the genetic fallacy. So you're basically just a construct of how you were raised by saying that very question, because the majority of the world is not going to ask that question, right? And so you've been formed by the atheistic enlightenment form of thinking. So you're going to say the genetic fallacy, which is, hey, you're just what your parents were. So you could say everything is formed by your upbringing. But I don't believe that's the case. I think we have the free will to actually decide to be honest truth seekers and hopefully push as much emotional bias and sociological bias out of the way as we possibly can.
Okay. I don't know. I still think that there's a big leap for me in like believing in like any religion just based on like you guys talked about it, but I still feel like there's somewhat of like a lack of like concrete evidence. And maybe that's just like, it's like two sides of a coin. Like it's not necessarily right or wrong. I don't know. But yeah, I'm still figuring out what I'm living.
Well, do you think you have a God-shaped hole that any type of pleasure, for example, ultimately those things are going to end or they're going to crush your soul. You know, if you live for money, that will crush you physically, emotionally, and psychologically. If you live for your family, I hate to say it, they're all going to be ripped away from you or you'll be ripped away from them when death hits. If you live for pleasure, ultimately, yet again, studies aren't good on that. You're going to ruin yourself.
Yeah.
And so the question becomes, all right, well, what's going to ultimately sustain me? I think a God-shaped hole shows that you want something, you need something even psychologically. That's why the incredible author, David Foster Wallace, as an atheist, sadly he hung himself because he had schizophrenia, oddly enough, but he was brilliant and he said, look, every single person on this planet worships. You give your ultimate authority to. You worship something. That is number one. You said kind of pleasure. All right, if it's not something infinite and transcendent, call it a God, then it will eat you alive. If you live for your own physical attractiveness, you will die 1,000 deaths before your death. Because you're going to be aging, right?
Yeah.
So I would just urge you, man, to look at, hey, wow, the psychological, emotional underpinnings alone of this God-shaped hole that psychologists, therapists, I mean, everybody's in therapy now, right? That they're talking about, what in the world is that? Is that evidence for a God? Or is that just some type of wish fulfillment? I think it's strong evidence for there being some type of God.
Yeah.
Now, once you land on that, then, okay, who might that God be?
In the dialogue above, the two speakers present the argument that hypocrisy in Christian history should not discredit Christ himself, and I observe that this distinction can be intellectually valid, yet it becomes persuasive only if it is paired with a consistent standard for evaluating evidence, authority, and moral accountability. The questioner raises a serious and fair challenge. Hypocrisy is not a minor flaw. Jesus denounces it as a central moral failure. If hypocrisy is widespread, the question is not merely, are there hypocrites? But why does the religion's public footprint so often contradict its founder's stated ethic? That is a structural question, not a personal insult. The respondent answers with a powerful countermove. Do not grant hypocrites the power to define the object of belief. He illustrates this by pointing to the African American church, people who endured Christian racism yet did not let corrupt representatives negate Christ. This is the strongest point so far because it exposes a hidden error many skeptics fall into, confusing representation with reality. In logic, this is the difference between discrediting a claim and discrediting a claimant. A corrupted messenger does not automatically falsify the message. However, there is a tension the respondent must face more directly. If the public knows Christ mainly through institutions, then institutions are not an irrelevant side issue. They are the primary pipeline of credibility. Saying ignore the hypocrites can sound like moving the goalposts unless Christianity can show that it has internal mechanisms that 1. Diagnose hypocrisy, 2. Correct it, and 3. Protect victims of institutional harm. Otherwise, the distinction becomes a shield. Christ stays untouchable while the church stays unaccountable. The conversation then pivots to epistemology. Do your homework and evaluate Muhammad Jesus by the evidence of life, teaching, death, and what happened afterward. That framework is reasonable in principle. A worldview should not be adopted by vibes. It should be examined. But the respondents' later argument about atheism as narcissistic hedonism overreaches. It frames unbelief as moral pathology rather than a live evidential position. That kind of framing can harden resistance, because a sincere agnostic who is unconvinced does not hear an invitation to truth-seeking. He hears an accusation about character. The sharpest takeaway is this: the debate is no longer only about hypocrisy or history. It is about the standards by which one assigns authority. If Christ is to be trusted, the respondent must show why the evidence warrants that trust, and then show how Christianity deals honestly with the institutional betrayals that have repeatedly obscured him. Without both halves, the argument remains incomplete. We now continue with the debate discussion. In the dialogue above, the two speakers present the argument that religious belief is largely shaped by upbringing rather than evidence, and I observe that this exchange exposes a deep confusion between sociological explanation and epistemic justification. The questioner raises what many consider an obvious point. Most people adopt the religion of their parents. This observation is empirically common and psychologically intuitive. However, the respondent correctly identifies the logical misstep when this observation is used to undermine truth claims. Explaining how a belief is acquired is not the same as showing that the belief is false. This is the essence of the genetic fallacy, and naming it is a legitimate philosophical move. That said, the respondent's tone risks overstating the case. Calling the question itself atheistic can sound like dismissing a sincere concern rather than refining it. The better version of the argument is this: upbringing influences belief formation, but influence does not equal determinism. If upbringing alone invalidated belief, then no belief, religious, scientific, moral, or political, could survive scrutiny, since all human reasoning is socially conditioned to some degree. The conversation then shifts from epistemology to existential psychology. The respondent introduces the idea of a God-shaped whole, arguing that all substitute objects of meaning, money, family, pleasure, status, eventually fail. This is a powerful existential claim rather than a strict proof. It resonates emotionally and psychologically, especially when framed through loss, aging, and death. However, it is important to recognize its limits. Existential need does not automatically establish metaphysical truth. A hunger for meaning may point toward transcendence, but it does not by itself identify which conception of God, if any, is correct. The mention of David Foster Wallace sharpens the point, but also introduces risk. Personal tragedy can illustrate existential fragility, yet it should not be used as a simplistic argument that atheism leads to despair. The strongest version of the argument is not atheists are unhappy, but rather human beings inevitably orient their lives around something ultimate, and finite objects often collapse under that weight. By the end of this segment, the discussion naturally turns toward the problem of hell. This is not accidental. Once God is framed as ultimate meaning and authority, moral accountability and final judgment become unavoidable questions. The debate is now moving from whether belief is inherited or chosen to whether divine justice, as Christianity presents it, is morally coherent. We now continue with the debate 𝗖𝗿𝗲𝗶𝗁 discussion. In the dialogue above, the two speakers present the argument that agnosticism is an unstable position when it comes to God, and I observe that this is one of the most philosophically serious moments of the entire discussion. The questioner claims a posture of default disbelief. In the absence of convincing evidence, non-belief feels safer and more rational. This is not an irrational stance. In many domains, science, law, everyday reasoning, suspending belief until sufficient evidence appears is a responsible epistemic habit. The questioner is not mocking faith. He is articulating an evidential threshold that has not yet been met for him. The respondent's counter-argument is not primarily evidential, but existential. He challenges the idea of default by pointing out that human life is not lived neutrally. Purpose, ambition, moral choice, and emotional investment already assume value judgments. In that sense, the respondent is correct. No one actually lives as if nothing matters. Even refusing belief is itself a lived orientation toward meaning. However, there is a subtle shift that deserves scrutiny. The respondent moves from, "you cannot live without values," to, "therefore, you cannot be agnostic about God." That leap is not logically airtight. One can affirm moral realism, purpose, and human dignity while remaining undecided about the ultimate metaphysical source of those values. The respondent is strongest when he shows that agnosticism cannot avoid existential commitment. He is weaker when he treats that commitment as equivalent to theism. Where the argument gains force is in the discussion of death. Funerals confront people with questions that abstract agnosticism struggles to answer emotionally, even if it remains coherent intellectually. The respondent is right to say that death forces the question of ultimate meaning into lived experience, not just theory. Yet emotional urgency does not automatically settle metaphysical truth. It intensifies the question. It does not answer it. This segment reveals the core divide. The questioner is operating with an evidential standard, while the respondent is operating with an existential and moral standard. Until those standards are clearly distinguished and possibly integrated, the conversation risks talking continuing past one another rather than converging. We now continue with the debate, discussion. In the dialogue above, the two speakers present a sustained confrontation between evidential skepticism and existential commitment, and I observe that the debate ultimately turns on a single unresolved question: authority. The skeptic's position is not shallow. He repeatedly appeals to evidence, moral intuition, and fairness. His resistance to doctrines such as hell and absolute obedience arises not from hostility, but from an unwillingness to surrender moral judgment without sufficient warrant. This is an intellectually honest stance. The Christian respondent, however, exposes a deeper layer beneath evidential debate. He argues that no human being lives neutrally. Purpose, value, morality, and hope already presuppose commitments that function like faith. The real question, therefore, is not whether faith exists, but whether it is placed in a reliable object. Christianity, as presented here, makes an uncompromising claim. Jesus is not merely informative, but authoritative. That authority cannot be selectively accepted. It demands either rejection or surrender. The resurrection becomes the decisive test because it alone can justify such authority. The debate does not end with proof, but with clarity. If the resurrection did not occur, Christianity should be abandoned. If it did occur, then resistance is no longer a matter of evidence alone, but of willingness to yield moral control. In that sense, the conversation succeeds not by forcing agreement, but by revealing what is truly at stake. We now continue with the debate, discussion.